Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask how big an age divide is there in contemporary politics and what explains it. Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Age appears to structure voting patterns in democracies around the world more today than perhaps ever before. One poll conducted before the UK's recent general election found that just 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds intended to vote Conservative, compared to 33% of those aged 65 or older. Big age divides are evident on the European continent as well, though not always exhibiting such a clear left-right pattern. The far-right Alternative for Deutschland and the National Rally in France have gained noteworthy support from the young. So what explains such divisions between the old and the young when it comes to voting? In particular, to what extent are these divisions underpinned by differences in voters' ideological preferences? And how have these differences changed over time? Well, a new article explores exactly these questions. It's by Tom O'Grady, Associate Professor in Political Science here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and I'm delighted that Tom joins me now. Welcome back, Tom, to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to have you on the podcast again. And I guess our starting point for this discussion should be voting patterns and the degree to which these are shaped by age. I said a little bit in the introduction about that, but do you want to maybe expand just a bit on what I said there? How far is it true that younger people and older people are voting differently from each other today?
Alan, thanks very much for having me back. It's great to be here. And you started with a really topical question, obviously, because we're recording this one day after the French legislative elections and just 3 days after the British elections, both of which have showed very interesting patterns by age. So let's start with Britain, which really exhibits an extremely stark divide by age, where we see much stronger support for the Labour Party amongst young people than amongst older cohorts. The older one gets, the less likely one is to vote Labour, and the more likely one is to vote Conservative. It's also the case that smaller parties of the left, like the Greens, and likely also some of the sort of pro-Gaza independents in the last election, were also more popular amongst the young, and to some extent at least, Reform, the sort of radical right party in the UK, a little more popular amongst the old. Now, zooming out a bit, how does that compare to patterns in other countries, and what are the broader patterns? There's a couple of broader patterns across countries. One is we should ask not just about voting, but also about non-voting. And it is the case across Europe in particular that young people are just less likely to vote overall than older people. That's certainly true in the UK, and it's certainly true almost everywhere. So it's important to talk not just about the choice of party, but the choice whether to participate or not. The second thing is that across countries, and this is to some extent true of the UK, but less so due to our voting system, generally speaking, the young are much less likely to vote for so-called mainstream parties. So whether one looks at the left or whether one looks at the right, young people are much more likely to vote for newer parties. On the left, that will be generally the Greens or radical left parties. And on the right, that would be radical right parties in most countries. So France is a good example here. Now, if you look at France, actually overall, I think this is missed, overall young people are more likely to vote for the left in France than any other generation. If you look at exit poll data, there's almost half of young people in France were voting for the left united list, which took in the socialists, the Greens, and the radical left, which is far bigger than older generations. Within that, the young are much more likely to vote for Greens and the radical left than they are for the Socialist Party, which is the old party of the left. But that's true across countries, that these newer parties like Greens and radical left attract the young. Generally speaking, the young do vote more left-wing than older generations. It's just that they vote for different parties within the left as well. On the right, it's also particularly true that parties of the mainstream right are really struggling across Europe to attract younger voters. And when younger voters are voting for right-wing parties, they're tending to be more likely to vote for the radical right than they are for mainstream parties. So really the core patterns are, one, less likely to vote, two, wherever they can do, they're less likely to vote for so-called mainstream parties like old socialist parties or conservative Christian Democrat parties.
Brilliant summary, thank you. And to what extent are these new patterns, or to what extent have young voters, always just been more radical, for example, than older voters, and therefore always inclined to vote for Greens on one side, maybe more radical right parties on the other side than older voters?
Well, it depends how far one goes back, but of course, many of these parties are pretty new on the scene in political terms. I mean, obviously, Green parties really started to emerge in the 1980s, but in most European countries, they only really became quote unquote big in the 1990s onwards. But also parties of the radical right, of course, have also always existed, but again, they tended to grow, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s. A big and important thing, and something I talk about in the article, is that there are just more parties today that people can choose to vote for. You know, we can't go back in time and say, well, what would have happened in the 1980s if there'd been these big Green parties and big radical right parties? It's quite possible that there would have been similar generational divides then, but there weren't. And to that extent, these are new patterns. And these are new patterns whether one looks at what's happening now or whether one looks at older generation at equivalent ages. So if we go back to, the baby boomers now, if we rewind 30 years and look at how baby boomers voted in their youth, they were even then much more likely to vote for mainstream parties overall. And so these changes are new in the sense that those choices largely didn't exist or weren't so possible for older generations. And also because people's choices tend to be somewhat sticky over time. So if people vote for, let's say, the Labour Party in Britain, in their 20s, they're also quite likely to be still voting for maybe their 50s. So there are these generational effects as well.
Do we see a similar pattern with turnout as well over time?
So absolutely. Turnout is highly generational in nature, in the sense that the older one's generation is today, the more likely one is to vote. So people who are currently in their 70s, 80s are the most likely to vote in pretty much all contemporary societies. And again, that's a pattern that doesn't just reflect what's happening today, but reflects what's always been the case for those generations. So again, if we were to rewind those generations back 30 or 40 years, look at what they were doing at an equivalent age to today as young people, we would find that they were voting at substantially higher rates then than young people are today. It isn't a new pattern in that sense, but it is a new pattern in the sense that, that there are now much larger generational divides in that as sort of time has wound itself forward.
Can we say, therefore, that the divisions that exist at the level of voting are really divisions that have always existed? It's just they're a bit bigger now than they used to be. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying?
I think that's a reasonably fair thing to say. I think the main point I was trying to make is that some of the party choices that exist today certainly didn't exist in the past. And so it's a bit difficult to make a comparison. But I think that's a roughly fair summary. I guess one might summarize it as the potential for these age differences in voting perhaps always existed, but in some sense it's easier to do that today because there's a much bigger menu of choices in most contemporary democracies. I guess the other thing that's changed over time is that there has been a kind of detachment of contemporary generations from some of the structural factors that used to link people to mainstream parties. So if we think about what politics was like 30 or 40 years ago in a country like Britain, it was quite strongly structured by social class. So people with higher income, higher class would tend to vote Conservative, people with lower income, lower class would tend to vote Labour. And there were quite strong sort of economic structural factors linking those people to mainstream parties. So for example, trade union membership was much larger. In the 1960s, 70s, people who were trade union members tended to be socialized early into voting Labour. So I guess that's one thing that has changed, is that a strong link between socio-structural factors, if you like, and voting has diminished. In some sense, that's left younger people today a bit more unmoored from some of those structural supports. And on the right, an example in much of Europe would be religion. So in a country like the Netherlands, for example, there was very strong religious patterns in voting, which again have diminished for younger generations.
Okay, and that takes us on very nicely to your article, where you're seeking to understand, you're trying to get beneath the hood, if you like, of these voting patterns to understand what are the factors that are actually driving attitudes in Europe today. So in the article, you focus on voters' ideological beliefs and looking at whether ideological beliefs are patterned in terms of age, just as voting patterns are patterned in terms of age. Do you want to tell us why you wanted to focus on this in this article?
Yes, and it links a little bit to what I just said about potential causes of voting change. So what I've emphasized so far are kind of changes that are structured in things other than ideology, if you like. We've talked about the availability of parties. We've talked about diminishing sort of links between social economic structure and voting. But of course, one might say, well, maybe the reason why young people and old people are voting so different today is because they're much more polarized than they were in the past. Maybe young people are, to use a word I don't particularly like, really woke, and old people are really conservative, but that wasn't the case 30 years ago, and that's why there are big differences. And so the article aims to ask, is it true? Is it true that the ideological divide in terms of what people actually want from government is larger today than it was 30 years ago? And to spoiler alert, the answer I find is no. Actually, young people and old people have been quite polarized from each other for a long time. It was true in the 1980s, and it's also true today, but it hasn't grown.
Now, just before we get further into those results, it's always important that we explore the methodology of an article such as this. And actually, I found the methodology here really interesting. And it hadn't quite occurred to me before I read it just how challenging it is to measure attitudes across quite a long period of time and across quite a large number of countries. And the article is very innovative in seeking to overcome these challenges. Do you want to explain what those challenges were and then how you overcome them in the article?
Yeah, so the article aims to study 27 European countries, and it studies them over a period from the 1980s roughly to the late 2010s. And one might think it would be easy to compare over time, but it turns out not to be. And the reason is this, that let's say you want to ask about someone's attitude to a concrete question, like, do you think the government should spend more money on unemployment benefits, for example? Now, what we really like is to have that same question asked to the same countries every year from the 1980s to today. But we don't have that because cross-national surveys are very unevenly available. They don't ask the same questions over time, and they don't ask the same questions in the same countries over time. And so it's very difficult to assess ideological change amongst age groups by saying, okay, how much did old people and young people disagree on that question in 1981? How much did they disagree on that same question in 2018? We largely can't do that. So there's lots of there's gaps in terms of the countries for which data is available, and there's gaps in terms of which questions are available. Now, one way that's been solved in the past is there is a survey called the Eurobarometer, and the Eurobarometer does have a question across all these countries that asks people, how left-wing or right-wing are you on a scale of 0 to 10? And lots of papers have been written using that question, but it's problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that one of the things that happened in contemporary politics, of course, is that the left and right now need to be defined in at least two dimensions, or possibly more. So we need to think about not just economic conservatism, but also social conservatism. For many people, that may not be the same thing. And so asking people to place themselves on a scale from 0 to 10, some people might think about, LGBT rights and gender equality. Other people might think about tax and spending. And so it's very difficult to know what's in people's minds when they answer that question. The second thing is that a lot of people actually just don't know what the label of left and right mean. So if you ask voters, what do they mean? They'll often get it wrong, or they may have a different definition than we do as surveyors. So we can't just ask them, what do we do in the article? Well, there's a couple of things that we do in the article. One is that I use a method called item response theory. And item response theory looks at all the questions that have been asked. And, let's say there's a question about unemployment benefits asked in 1 year and a question about, health spending asked in another year. An item response theory model estimates the relationship of each of those questions to someone's conservatism. So imagine that the model sees, if you like, a question about unemployment benefits in 1 year and a question about health in another year. It knows what those questions tell us about conservatism, and it can adjust its estimate of conservatism based on how important those individual questions are in discriminating someone's conservatism. So that's one thing it does, is it kind of gains knowledge about what each survey question tells us. The second thing I do is something called a multi-level model. So we take those estimates, and in some countries and in some years, it's going to be no data, or it's going to be very sparse. And what that model does is it does something called smoothing over time. So imagine that your country in the year 1990 has no data, but we know something about other similar countries at the same time, or we know something about that same country the year before or the year after. The multi-level model basically borrows information from those other countries and assumes that our country in 1990 is going to be similar to other similar countries at that time and similar to itself in the past and in the future. So it kind of imputes missing data in that way, using information from other similar countries. And in that way, it acts like a kind of filling in the dots method, if you like. I hope that was all right. That was a very quick summary of a quite complex methodology.
That was brilliant, yes. And of course, interested readers will be able to find more in the article, and more particularly, I think, in the supplementary materials to the
Absolutely,
article, which
yes.
are available online. Now, you mentioned there the two dimensions of ideological variation that political scientists talk about quite a lot. So there's the economic left-right division, and then there's also the social division between more socially conservative and socially liberal perspectives. But in the article, you actually focus on four dimensions in attitudes. So you have two different economic aspects, and you also separate out most of the social category that we often talk about as one category, and then immigration attitudes as a distinctive category. Why was it that it was necessary to have those four categories in the analysis?
I mean, that's a great question. And I guess I would say it wasn't necessary, but it was useful. I mean, there's kind of this debate in political science about how many dimensions of political conflict are there. And it can get a bit arcane and a bit silly. And my view is that we're not physicists. We're not describing a world that has definite physical properties. There are useful ways to talk about the world, and there are unuseful ways to talk about the world. And so one answer to your question is that it proved most useful to talk about four dimensions. Now, why is that? Let's start with the economic dimension. So instead of talking about, economic conservatism in terms of one dimension, I talk about it in two ways. And the reason for that is that we want to be able to distinguish changes in people's actual ideological beliefs, that they genuinely want a smaller government, that they genuinely want lower taxes, from the level of tax and spending in an actual economy. So someone's answer to a question, how much more spending do you want? It might go up because they've become more left-wing, or it might go up because spending has fallen and people want public services to be improved, even though there's no underlying change in their own ideology. So what I do there is I separate out change in economic ideology into two scales, one of which I call relative economic preferences and the other I call absolute. Relative preferences are all these spending questions. How much more spending would you like on healthcare? How much more spending would you like on pensions? And so on. So we have that across countries. That's a little bit imperfect as a measure of ideology because it's going to be very affected by how much countries are spending. Then we have a second scale, which is called absolute economic preferences. And that will address questions like, should the government redistribute income from the rich to the poor in a general sense? Is it just or right that the government taxes people and redistributes the income in terms of public services and so on? Now, it's obviously not perfectly possible to separate those two things, but I do my very best to separate those out so that we can get a measure of economic ideology that is more about ideology and a second measure that's more about spending. Then on the other side, it is certainly the case that generally speaking, if you know how conservative someone is on immigration, you probably also know how conservative they are on other issues like LGBT equality, gender equality, etc. So in some sense, it might be reasonable, and I certainly wouldn't oppose this, to talk about social conservatism in terms of one dimension. What is different is that over time, especially within particular countries, there's been quite a different evolution of beliefs about immigration to beliefs about other issues. So whereas there's been a pretty continuous decline in social conservatism and a pretty continuous rise in support for things like LGBT rights, that's not necessarily the case for immigration. So in many countries, even amongst young people, changes in conservatism around immigration is either flat, or in some countries, particularly after the refugee crisis in the mid-2010s, has actually become more conservative over time. So I think it's quite useful to distinguish what's happened over time, particularly with immigration and social conservatism, even though it would be equally, I think, plausible and reasonable to talk about them in the same scale.
Great. Let's get into the results then, the most important part of the paper and of our discussion. And you've already given us some hints of what you found, but let's just go into a bit more detail here. How would you characterize the key results, the key takeaways that you want people to get from this paper?
Well, a couple of things. So let's talk about social conservatism first, because I think that's where the results are clearest and perhaps most important for how we began the discussion today. If one looks at social conservatism, which is about, as I said, things like gender equality, LGBT equality, we find that if you look today, young people and old people are very divided, and that shouldn't surprise us. But, and this is the important thing, that divide has not changed over time. Yeah, it's about as big today as it was in the 1980s. So old people and young people were just as divided then as they are now. Why is that? Well, it's due to two things. One is that each successive generation has been born more left-wing than their predecessors and has tended to stay more left-wing over time. 18-year-olds today are entering the political life much more socially progressive than 18-year-olds 40 years ago. But the second thing that's happened is that all generations have become more socially liberal over time as they've aged. Someone who was born, let's say, in the 1950s or 1960s has generally, on average, become much more progressive over time on something like LGBT rights. If you look at even amongst people in their 60s, 70s today, they've become much more supportive over time of those issues. The same things happen to young people. So you've got these unequal starting points, and you've got change over time, and they've tended to kind of keep pace with each other in the sense that the gap exists, but the gap has remained the same. And I think this is quite important. We can sometimes, I think, stereotype older people as deeply conservative or resistant to change. And that simply isn't true if one looks at the data. Whilst it's certainly true that older people are more conservative than young people, they have become substantially less conservative themselves over time, keeping that gap about the same. So I think that's the core message on social conservatism, that there is not strong evidence of rising polarization by age. Now, what do we find on economic issues? We find something really quite different. It's in fact the case that if one looks across Europe today, young people are actually generally slightly more conservative on economic issues than the oldest generations. It's not true in every country, it's true to different degrees. But generally speaking, I would characterize younger people in Europe today as relatively libertarian. They want personal freedom. They certainly want it in terms of social issues, but they also generally are more opposed to tax and spending than older people. And so you have this interesting, perhaps slightly unexpected finding, but certainly at least on tax and spending, there is not this pattern that one might expect where young people are really socialist and older people are really conservative. And that gap has evolved in a much more sort of haphazard sense than the gap on social conservatism over time. So again, it's not the case that there's a much bigger divide today than there was 30 years ago.
Were you surprised by these findings?
I was surprised by the findings on economics when I first looked at them, and then I became a bit less surprised as I started looking at other people's findings and tried to understand them. I was less surprised by the findings on social conservatism, I think. Perhaps a little bit surprised to see how much older people had actually liberalized over time, but that was less surprising. Now, on economics, when one actually now starts to think about it, there are a couple of good reasons why these patterns might exist. One is about socialization. The environment that you grow up in as a young person really affects your beliefs, and it tends to affect them in a long-lasting way. Younger people today have grown up in a much more, quote-unquote, neoliberal environment than young people 40 or 50 years ago. So they're used to an era of higher inequality, of smaller governments, of lower benefits, of all of these things, and a political environment where, political discourse tends to emphasize those things much less. And one interesting thing that supports this idea is that it's actually Eastern European countries where the young people are most different to old people on tax and spending. So there's a clear suggestion there that's about the legacy of communism, that their elders grew up under communism, they've grown up under capitalism, there's a big difference. The second reason why it might make sense is just about what governments spend money on and in whose interest it is to raise taxes. So think about a young person in Britain today, for example. If you said to them, the government's going to raise taxes, what do we think it will probably be spent on? Well, judging by the last 10 years, it's most likely to be spent on pensions and healthcare. And so there's a kind of rational, self-interested, if you like, reason for young people to be skeptical of spending, simply because it may not and has not generally been spent on them. And so they might think, oh, well, I wouldn't mind a tax rise, but just not the tax rises that we're currently getting, because they don't tend to go to me. So I was a bit surprised at first, and then I think as I started to think about it, read more, understand it more, it does start to make more sense to me.
And how much variation is there across countries in this? And you mentioned the UK there, for example, and we've just seen an election in the UK in which young voters, voted overwhelmingly for parties on the left. Is that despite their having quite conservative, quite right-wing views on taxation and spending?
That's an interesting question. So I guess there's a couple of things to say here. One is that I think it is true that young people, not just in Britain, but everywhere, are tending to weigh more heavily some issues like climate change, perhaps even in the last election, the war in Gaza, and some economic issues. So I think there's some truth in that. I think the second thing is that, we have not, generally speaking, had a political discourse that emphasizes things that young people would like money to be spent on. Now, if you're a political party like the Greens that says we want to perhaps raise taxes, redistribute income, and we're going to spend that money on tackling the climate crisis, well, yes, young people do support that in bigger numbers. So I think it's important to distinguish whether young people are really intrinsically more conservative or whether they're just more conservative in the spending environment that we've tended to have over the past 10 years. And I think some of the voting data suggests that it may be that it's really about what money is spent on. So very popular if you say you're going to spend the money on climate change as opposed to spending the money on other things. The last thing to say is that there's been an interesting age change in how young people think about the benefits system and redistribution. What we see now is that even if there's a bit more skepticism on the spending side, if you ask people who are they sympathetic to, who do they think deserves help, young people are more likely in the UK to say that they think benefits claimants are more deserving, to think that they should have help. Some of that's linked to views on race and racial injustice. And some of that's about education. Young people are more educated, and education is very strongly tied to one's beliefs about the moral deservingness of the beneficiaries of government spending.
Great. We've talked about voting patterns. Then we went under the hood and explored to what extent these can be kind of mapped on, if you like, to changes also in underlying attitudes on issues. Let's go back in our final few minutes to voting patterns and the relationship between ideology and voting patterns. You were getting into that a little bit in the last answer there, but how would you characterize that relationship? What do we learn from this study about the degree to which the voting patterns are shaped by changes in ideology, or rather by changes in other factors?
Well, I think what we've learned are a few things. The first is that it really matters what choice is available to voters, and I've already emphasized this, that I'm not convinced that the large age divides we've seen are really about young and old people being far more divided than they were in the past. I think it's much more about the menu of choices available to them being different. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is that some of the age differences in voting, particularly among young people, are really about a dimension that I almost don't capture in the paper, and that's about what one might call anti-system and pro-system. So I think a clear pattern that's emerged in Europe is that wherever there are parties that challenge the status quo, the system, so in a country like Spain, there might be a party like Podemos, who are a kind of left-wing anti-system party. In a country like Italy, it might be the Five Star Movement. There's been this rise in what's called the pirate parties in some countries. And in Britain, clearly the Green Party. Wherever there have been anti-system parties promising radical change, they've tended to attract young people. And that may be a little bit different to simply about ideological beliefs. So I think and the third thing I would have said, let me say one more thing, is that some of the rise in radical right voting among young people in Europe may not be wholly ideological, but maybe a bit linked to what I just said about radical change, which is that there's very clearly a gender divide in support for the radical right, where young men are much more likely than young women to vote for the radical right. And some of that, I think, is about the declining status of young men, declining opportunities for young men, particularly young men with low education, whether that's in the workplace, but also potentially in the marriage market, as emphasized by people like Alice Evans, who've studied this. So amongst young and low-educated men, there's a bit of a link between, I think, I want to put it this way, fragile masculinity and voting. And there's a clear kind of emphasis on manliness, on masculinity amongst some of these radical right parties, which again is not directly about ideology, but it's maybe about the opportunities that are available and about the sort of changing availability of political options, where there's this thing called the manosphere on social media, which has been really strongly linked to things like voting for the AfD, attracting disaffected young men.
Final question. Some people have talked of late of politics as turning into a war of the generations. Is that an accurate description?
I think I'm a bit more skeptical of that than other people. I think it's really important to keep in context some of these differences. Yes, there are divides in ideology today between young people and old people, but actually when we drill down and look at the individual issues, there's actually a bit of a difference in the difference, if you like, now than there was 30 or 40 years ago. Take something like marriage equality, LGBT rights. If we looked 30 years ago, young people would have been supportive of same-sex marriage, whereas old people would have opposed it. If we look today at a country like the UK, even a majority of people in their 60s and 70s are supportive of same-sex marriage. So there are differences in the degree of support, but there's not so much a difference in whether the thing should happen or not. Or there might be a difference in priorities. And interestingly, I think where people really expected to see a quote-unquote war of the generations was on something like pension spending, where there was this expectation that old people will be much more supportive of pension spending than young people. Again, if we look at the data, the degrees are degrees of difference rather than degrees of absolute support. So yes, young people are a bit less likely to say pension spending should go way up, but pension spending is incredibly popular amongst everyone. Everybody thinks pensions should be generous and should be more generous than they are today. Why is that? I mean, I think that we should emphasize not just a war of generations, but also intergenerational altruism. People's grandparents are just really popular politically. Nobody wants grandma to have less money to spend than she has today. People who are young don't want grandma to be made poorer. And the second thing is, of course, that everyone's going to get old one day. And so it's not really in the interest of young people today to have lower pension spending. That means their own pensions are going to be lower. And linked to that, there's also been some very interesting new research from Jane Green and co-authors at Oxford looking at altruism the other way, that actually there's increasing support for things like increased house building amongst older people who have an altruistic interest in their children and their grandchildren having a better life. I think it's important not to just look at differences in voting and say that there's an age war over issues. Clearly there are some differences, but I don't think the differences in attitudes are as big as some people think they are. And I think we should really think carefully about the ways that generations actually support each other and care about each other's issues.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation about such an important topic today, and a very immediate topic in the wake, as you mentioned right at the start, of major elections, both in the UK and in France. So thank you for a great conversation. We have been discussing Tom O'Grady's article, Is Ideological Polarisation by Age Group Growing in Europe?, published late last year in the European Journal of Political Research. This has been our last episode for the current season. UCL Uncovering Politics will be taking its summer break over the next few months while we all knuckle down doing some fresh research. But you can always look up our back catalogue, where you will find episodes on topics as diverse as the political philosophy of the UK healthcare crisis, whether Russian assets should be seized, the war... Sorry, that doesn't make sense, what I've written there. Apologies to Eleanor. The role of war in state building and the significance of protest in democracy. We'll be back in the autumn, so remember to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode is the final one to have been researched by Alice Hart. Enormous thanks to you, Alice, for all your great work and support over the last couple of years. You've done a terrific job. Huge thanks also to our brilliant producer, Eleanor Kingwell-Banham, and our theme music is written and performed, as ever, by the ever-sparkling John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening, and have a great summer.